Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to IPI's Zoom briefing today with our friend John Fund on Our Broken Elections, his recent book. My name's Tom Giovanetti. I'm the president of the Institute for Policy Innovation. We are a 35-year-old free market conservative think tank based in Dallas, Texas. I'd like to welcome you all to our briefing today. We appreciate having you here. I'd also like to especially thank those of you who are financial supporters of IPI's work. We very much appreciate it. You make it possible for us to do events like this. And so we very much appreciate your support. And if after this discussion, you decide you'd like to know more about becoming part of IPI, please contact Addie Crimmins at IPI, and she'll be delighted to tell you about our Giving Society or other ways that you can be part of our work here. We're really delighted to have longtime friend of IPI, John Fund, with us today to talk through his recent book. John is an expert on elections, voting, and vote fraud. He has closely covered this set of issues for at least a couple of decades. And he's in a better position than almost anyone to talk about the nuts and bolts of voting and elections in a calm, fact-based way that is calibrated to the proper level of concern that we should all have about our elections. John is the national affairs columnist at National Review. And this is the book we're talking about today is John's fifth book on voting and elections. We encourage you to buy a copy of John's book. I just want to prove that I, in fact, have a copy of it right here on my iPad. Our Broken Elections, How the Left Changed the Way You Vote. John's book and the content John is going to share with us today is a far superior way of being able to engage in a knowledgeable way on this issue of vote fraud and voting, far superior than just circulating whatever happens to be viral on social media at the moment. So again, we're really delighted, John, to have you with us today. So John, let's start off. I want to sort of set the context here for this discussion. It seems to me that there is a strong spectrum of opinion on this issue of vote fraud, the degree of fraud that we have, how secure or how insecure our elections are. On one extreme, there are people who believe that the 2020 election was stolen in a carefully coordinated national and even international conspiracy. That is not where we are, but I know that some folks are there. There's another view that in a couple of carefully strategic places like Arizona, Pennsylvania, Georgia, there was discrete kinds of mischief that went on that actually had the effect of swinging the election from Donald Trump to Joe Biden. But then there are folks on the other side who think this is all just a load of hooey, that Republicans have invented this issue of vote fraud out of whole cloth in an attempt to disenfranchise voters on the other side of the aisle. And that's not where we are either. And I think that one of the great things about your book is that you really go through this in a fact-based way. And you've spent your time researching it. You can tell us exactly what's going on. And I think we're really pleased as a policy organization that takes work seriously to work with people and to talk with people and to present people to our audience who are substantial and fact-based. And so, John, we really appreciate you making time for us today in your busy schedule. So we'd love to hear you talk through some of these issues with our audience, talk about sort of the main thrust of your book and some of the interesting things that you've uncovered, and then we'll get to a pretty robust Q&A. So with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Tom. And my co-author, Hans von Spakovsky, who heads the election integrity unit at the Heritage Foundation, and I spent a lot of time in this book with one goal in mind, and that was to present a case about what went wrong or awry in the 2020 election that could be completely and thoroughly documented. We have 37 pages of footnotes. And you can, with anyone you discuss about the 2020 election, you don't have to go into whether or not the Chinese computer hackers were involved or whether Venezuela was involved. That was what some of the allegations that some of the more bizarre Trump lawyers came up with briefly. You can talk about what really went wrong. And what went wrong wasn't always voter fraud. We have a decentralized election system. It's run at the local and county level. That's a good thing, but it means there's a lot of variation in quality. So you have some places that have a long tradition of, shall we say, misgovernment, mismanagement, that you can't always tell where the fraud begins and the incompetence ends. And I would point to places like, the Rio Grande Valley in Texas, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Philadelphia, Chicago, which is famous for having been involved in the likely theft of the 1960 election from Richard Nixon when he ran against John F. Kennedy and had to deal with Mayor Daley of Chicago. So the book is an optimistic book in the sense that even though we can't always find fraud, we can find the breeding grounds, the swamps where it grows and circulates. And what happened in 2020 was a unique set of circumstances because of COVID, whereby as soon as COVID led to lockdowns in March of 2020, the left took off the shelf all of the pre-existing ideas they had for how to boost voter turnout artificially, to go around election safeguards, to declare emergencies and new procedures where legislatures hadn't acted, and it's the legislatures that are supposed to change the law. We had health directors change election laws, even though that's not part of their purview. So the whole end result of that was a lot of things happened that hadn't happened in any previous election. You had a tsunami of mail-in ballots. Now, I'm in favor of some absentee voting. I think early voting is better. Texas pioneered early voting in the 1990s. Early voting is you go to a polling location, a county courthouse, a school, a library. There's a temporary voting facility there. You vote there before the election, 2 weeks in advance or whatever. And it's under the supervision of election officials. So they can monitor it and make sure that there's not undue pressure or ballot harvesting or the collection of ballots from stolen from mailboxes, which happens a lot, for example, in Dallas. And what you find is that we can't prove that the things I mentioned led to fraud in almost all cases, but we can certainly say it created an engraved invitation, an open playing field for anyone who wanted to commit fraud. And the real problem here is this. The Trump people bear some responsibility for this. They were warned that COVID would be used as a pretext to change the election laws. Their lawyers were unprepared. Jared Kushner, who was the de facto campaign manager, he's the president's son-in-law in the White House. He met with various lawyers and experts who warned him that this was happening, that they had to have a 5-alarm fire legal team ready, in fact, operating to file lawsuits and try to overturn these provisions. Because here's the problem. You and I may find circumstantial evidence that there was shenanigans, hanky-panky, but it has to stand up in a court of law. It's a high standard. And in 2020, it had to stand up in a court of law between about the 10th of November, when the election results came in, and frankly, about December 15th when the Electoral College met. And then there was maybe one other window, which was January 6th, which of course is when the Congress counted the electoral vote and we had the riot on Capitol Hill, a very unfortunate event. So the real problem was these mail-in ballots, for example. Many states had so many mail-in ballots come in because it was so easy. Many states, like New Jersey and California, mailed a ballot to everyone on the voter rolls, everyone. Even though the Pew Research Center, which is a liberal think tank, has long ago found that between 15 and 25% of voter registrations are invalid. They're people who've moved. They're people who are dead. They're people who haven't been taken from the rolls, even though they haven't voted forever. Los Angeles County hadn't cleaned up its voter rolls in 20 years. They finally are doing it now. They're removing 1.6 million people from a single county in the voter registration rolls. So when these mail-in ballots come in, there was such a tsunami in many states, they couldn't handle it. Their $12 an hour clerks they were hiring basically in some cases just gave up, or their supervisors said, wave them through, otherwise we'll be counting these votes for months. And in Georgia, for example, the ballot comes in and it's two parts with perforation in the middle. One part is the ballot. The other part is all of the information about the voter, where they live, who they are, a signature. In some places, they even required a notary public sign it. And the ballots were there, and the clerk looks at the ballot, looks at the signature. They're not trained in graphology or signature analysis. There was almost no rejections, even though a lot of people were using the mail-in ballot for the first time. And after they check the vote, they tear the ballot in half. The part with the voter choices on it goes into the pile with all the other ballots. The part that has the voters' information on it goes into another pile. You could never reunite the two after you separate them. So that was one problem. And then was the problem of Zuckerbucks. Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook and his wife contributed between $350 and $450 million to help get out the vote, to help improve election processes. Well, in reality, even though the money was available to, in theory, every election office, in reality, it was really pushed on urban voting centers like Philadelphia, Phoenix, Atlanta, and other such places, because I suspect that's where the votes that they wanted to be cast could be counted. And I'll give you an example. In Wisconsin, in Green Bay, Wisconsin, the county clerk almost resigned and had a nervous breakdown because it turned out that the foundation that was monitoring these grants was basically taking over her office and ordering people around. She basically was pushed to the sidelines because the Democratic mayor didn't want her running the election. Who knows what happened in Green Bay? We still don't. Zuckerberg's foundation, the Center for Civic Life, went to Philadelphia, and on Labor Day, which is not normally a day you conduct business, the Philadelphia City Council conducted an emergency 10-minute meeting over Zoom. And the sole purpose of that meeting was to approve a contract between the city of Philadelphia and the Center for Civic Life, Zuckerberg's group, about how they would spend $10 million getting out the vote and improving election processes in Philadelphia on election day. Well, Tom, the entire budget of the Board of Elections in Philadelphia is $12 million a year. This was effectively doubling it for one election. And I know where some of the money went. It went to mobile vans that would circulate around collecting ballots. It went to voter registration drives in certain neighborhoods where people were pretty sure how people were going to vote. It was an outrageous intervention in the political process. Imagine, Tom, if you had a company in Dallas, that had a, sketchy record on safety. They didn't really care that much about it. And they were really bothered by all these OSHA inspectors that would come around and inspect them. So what if this company goes to the local OSHA office in Dallas and says, we think you're great guys. We may have had some disagreements in the past, but really, really want to help you out. And we have a foundation. Nonprofit. And if you just agree to tweak your enforcement guidelines just a little bit here or a little bit there, we got a nice big fat check for you that you can use to spend on almost anything you want. We have some suggestions for you, but it's free money. You can remodel your offices. You can do all kinds of interesting, neat things. You can expand, buy new voting equipment. Well, Tom, what would we say about that? We would say that was regular.
Like that, can't you?
Well, Tom, you're an economist. Have you heard of regulatory capture?
There's electoral system capture, exactly.
Exactly, that's what this is. And we would never allow that. That's why 32 states, since they came up with this idea, it wasn't illegal except maybe in one state, because no one had thought anyone would have the chutzpah to do it. But it's been made illegal in 32 states, and some of it was money that was spent in Texas. So that goes to my next and last point before we move on, which is there's two new items that have come up just today on how shenanigans in 2020 are being repeated or even refined and improved in 2022. I mentioned the Zuckerbucks. Milwaukee has announced the Get Out the Vote 2022 effort. They say that they have foundations that have contributed money to help with getting out the vote and registering people and all of that. They won't tell anyone who they are. They won't release the contracts. They won't answer any questions about them. They imply that city facilities and equipment is going to be used in perpetuating this. And it's a real scandal. Wisconsin has a Democratic governor that vetoed a bill and the legislature passed to ban Zuckerbucks. And apparently they're coming back under a new name, under new mismanagement. The second case involves New York State. Now, New York State is viewed as a very liberal state, and it is 61% for Biden. But last year, the Democratic legislature tried to pull three fast ones on the voters. They put three ballot questions on the statewide ballot. First question, do you want to have same-day registration in New York State? This is where you show up at the polls, you're not on the rolls, you get to register, you get to vote the same day, and there's really very little to prevent you from giving any address you want, voting, and then when the card comes welcoming you as a new voter, it goes to some vacant lot or gets returned address unknown. It's very dangerous. It's probably how Al Franken got elected in 2008, and his vote was the deciding vote that brought us Obamacare. If people want to ask, does voter fraud ever change public policy outcomes? It sure did. We got Obamacare because of voter fraud. And so and the second question was, do you want to get rid of New York's rule that if you want an absentee ballot in the mail, you have to have an excuse? And it has to be illness or absence from the area, something that's real, and you have to attest to that. And the third one was to make it easier to gerrymander the state, which the courts have since decided the Democratic legislature did and thrown out that plan. Well, even though the opponents of these three measures were outspent probably 20-1, New York voters exercised common sense and they said no to all three. So you'd think that the folks in Albany and the new governor Hochul would get the message. No. What has the Democratic Party done? It has sent out millions of absentee ballot application forms to voters all over the state. They come in an envelope that looks like a government envelope. The fact that it's paid for and printed by the Democratic Party is in microtype. And it basically tells the voter, we filled out this application for you. All you have to do is mail it in. Well, Tom, here's the problem. The ballot is pre-filled out with the excuse filled in. It's listed as COVID. Now, there's two problems with that. Probably not true. Most people have had COVID. They're not getting it again. Second problem, the COVID emergency in New York is officially over. So that's not an excuse anymore. I mean, it would be like saying I have the common cold and I know I'm going to have the common cold on election day, and therefore I want an absentee ballot. This is completely outrageous. You're basically circumventing all of the guidelines to prevent mail-in voter fraud by basically providing an engraved invitation to the voter to accept whatever you want to pre-fill out for them, and all they do is sign it and mail it in. This treats the voter like just another commodity to be processed and their vote counted. So I have other examples of this that are happening right now, but maybe we can move on to specific questions you have, or I'm happy to take questions from the audience during the program or even at the end, as you prefer.
Sure. John, I'm going to ask you a couple questions, and then I'll see if Dr. Matthews has some questions for you as well. The first question I have for you is sort of in the context of the big sort. So the big sort is this phenomenon where more conservative people are moving to red states and more progressive people are moving to blue states or remaining in blue states. And so you have the result of red states getting redder and blue states seemingly getting bluer. If it's primarily red states who are serious about the integrity of their elections process, and if it's primarily blue states who are intentionally loosening and making sloppy their voting process, what is the political effects of that like in the context of the big sort? It strikes me that that will at the very least exacerbate maybe this difference between the electoral college results and the popular vote results and things like that. But what are your thoughts on the result of the red team trying to police their voting systems and the blue team not?
You make a very good point, and I hadn't really thought about it until now. So kudos to you. It clearly presents problems because we're a very diverse country, all kinds of different people, all kinds of different local circumstances. Anything that creates a two-tier system, we've always worried about, an inequality gap. We always worry about, we worry about whether or not people have the fastest broadband, in rural areas versus urban areas. We worry about inequalities or mismatches in everything. Well, if you have a mismatch in how the laws are enforced, how the rule of law is the rule of law in one state and it's the rule of half a law in the other state, that creates real problems. It undermines confidence in the national election. The Supreme Court unanimously in a case in Arizona about 15 years ago ruled that the mere perception that an election is imbalanced, out of whack, not counting votes properly, unfair, can destroy faith in democracy, lower voter turnout, and make it much harder for government to rally support for legitimate governmental actions and legitimate governmental functions. So, yes, voter fraud can be very serious because you can tilt the playing field and elect someone who wasn't the choice of the voter. But even worse, the cynicism that it brings. I mean, look at this. In 1964, 80% of people thought the government was doing the right thing most of the time. Now that's about 15%. A part of that is some people believe their vote doesn't count or it's not counted accurately or they can't be sure of it.
Yeah, it's not a violent crime other than the fact that it does violence to the very confidence that people have in the democratic system.
Well said, it's corrosive.
Yeah, absolutely. My second question is somewhat related. You started off by reminding us all that we have a decentralized election system, and I think we still prefer that. I think the only thing worse than what we have right now would be having the federal government taking a bigger role, I think.
Well, that's what Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer wanted to do.
Right.
The reason that right after they took control of the House and Senate in 2020 and had Biden in the White House to sign anything they sent him, they made SR1, the first bill introduced in the Senate, and HR1, the first bill introduced in the House, a national takeover of our elections, which would have basically destroyed the power the states have in the Constitution to run their own elections. It would have made it illegal for states effectively to have any form of voter ID. It would have mandated same-day registration. It would have had a whole set. It would have politicized the Federal Election Commission, which is right now balanced with a tied vote between the parties. It would have been a disaster. And if it weren't for Senator Sinema of Arizona and Senator Manchin of West Virginia, who wouldn't move to break the filibuster rules or change the filibuster rules, we would have had that signed by Joe Biden, and we would be seeing a world of litigation, a world of outrage, far more cynicism, and a completely chaotic election this year.
And that is great transition to where I wanted to go with that question, which is this. Because we have decentralized elections, because states and actually counties run our elections, in observing what happened in Pennsylvania in 2020, it occurred to me that, if the voters of a state want a lousy, corrupt election system, I guess they're entitled to have a lousy, corrupt election system if that's what they want. But at some point, some of these infractions that you describe have to be illegal. I mean, mailing out to people pre-filled out ballots and applications.
Efficiency measure, Tom.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we have, for instance, over the years opposed these proposals essentially to have the IRS calculate your tax liability for you, right? And then just say,
side of the IRS or not.
We've already done the hard work for you. Just sign below, and the smacks of that.
You're absolutely right. And I think that this system breaks down in three levels. There's incompetence, some of it genuine. They don't know what they're doing. Look at the New York City Board of Elections, which I defy anyone to think, is worthy of. Well, let's just put it this way: the New York City Board of Elections, you could walk through their deepest thoughts and not get your ankles wet. Then there's practiced incompetence. Have you ever had a kid at home and you tell them to clean their room and they sort of swirl around there and move things around, but they don't really clean it? So you get so frustrated and you end up cleaning it for them, right? Practiced incompetence. You look stupid, so you can get away with something.
This is how I do with loading the dishwasher at home. I purposely do a terrible job so that my wife doesn't even want me to do it at all.
I load the dishwasher and I'm so bad at it. It's not purposeful. I really am bad at it. So then there's the level of I would call mischief and unethical, and that's what the Pennsylvania Supreme Court did. It's probably unconstitutional as well, except they're the final court of appeal in Pennsylvania. It makes it difficult. They ruled that any ballot received by Friday after the election, which is 3 days after the election, any ballot would be counted even if it had no postmark. Now, it doesn't take a genius to figure out. You have people sitting around on election night and they figure out, we're going to come up just short, just a little short. God, if we only had 1,800 more votes somewhere. Well, Wednesday morning, you put 1,800 votes in the mailbox, no postmark. They arrive on Friday because they're local mail. Get them counted. Hosanna, your wishes have been answered. Your prayers have been answered.
Well, again, because of our federal system, because of our decentralized system, you had this problem. You praised our Attorney General in Texas, Ken Paxton, a little while ago, and he does many things that are praiseworthy. On the other hand, I thought it was kind of ludicrous when the Texas Attorney General sued about the voting practices in Pennsylvania. I thought it was obvious that he would not have standing to sue in a case like that. So you have a situation where only the people within the state itself really can force the state to do a good job. The Supreme Court is going to be
there's some limits. No, there's some limits.
Okay.
We have a Voting Rights Act because in the pre-Civil Rights Act era, you had some states that were basically making it nearly impossible for blacks in the South and in some other places to vote. So the federal government had a carve out. In extreme circumstances, the federal government could come in and force change. We have some examples of that. States and cities will sign up for federal grants to buy new voting technology, for example. Well, in exchange for that, there's a requirement they clean up their voter rolls, the ones I mentioned earlier that are so outdated. Well, a lot of states don't do that, and the federal government hasn't been suing them, and that has to change. It's certainly not going to change under Joe Biden, though. But that would be something the federal government does have a role in because it's the federal government's money. So you can set some standards. In addition, there are some places where if the circumstance is so extreme that if there's an equal protection violation, or you have two voters that are treated, dramatically differently based on where they live in the state, that could run afoul of the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. And some private groups are empowered to sue on that basis. The Public Interest Legal Foundation is one of them. They're doing a great job using Freedom of Information Act requests to, well, let me tell you an example of how you can commit fraud on the cheap. Lots of states, Pennsylvania being one of them, really don't check if you sign up for registering to vote if you getting your driver's license renewed. So over about 15-year period, they basically didn't have any controls. So non-citizens, these are people who have resident alien cards or green cards. They're here legally, but they're not citizens. They would register to vote in Pennsylvania automatically. They didn't even know it was happening in many cases because the system didn't stop them. It didn't say, you must attest, you must swear that you're not a citizen if you want to register to vote. Well, that turned out to be 160,000 people. Pennsylvania was a 40,000 vote election last time. I'm just saying that that's unacceptable anomaly that could have swung an election, and people are legitimately mad about it. And it was only discovered by accident.
You can almost envision a scenario where somebody in that situation, they're not a citizen, they are automatically registered to vote, they don't even know it. Then they get mailed a ballot, right?
And they think it must be legal because they mailed.
Yeah, they could almost, like, with the best of intentions, think they're doing what they're supposed to do.
It's even worse than that. There are known examples of people who are signed up at shopping malls and other places to register to vote. And that some people will ask, well, don't I have to be a citizen? And they'll say, oh, well, if you're in the process of getting citizenship, you're thinking about it, that's enough. Well, here's the problem. We have people all over the country who decide finally to pay the money and the fees to become citizens. And it basically requires a lawyer, to consult with them beforehand. There's a lot of paperwork. So the lawyer will ask you a bunch of questions. Have you been convicted of a crime? Are you of good moral character? Because those are reasons to deny someone citizenship. And then they'll ask, are you registered to vote? And if you say yes, they'll say, get your name off that list immediately, because that could be used as a strike against you to becoming a citizen. So it's a very cruel trick that some of these voter registration groups play. They basically put the future of some of the people they're signing up, almost all of whom in many cases are minorities, in jeopardy because they put their citizenship status at risk. Well, so here's what happens. And this is what Public Interest Legal Foundation is doing. They will mail one Freedom of Information Act request to the county and say, please send us your voter registration list, which is public information. Then they'll mail the local court system. Federal courts are easier than state courts, and say, please send us the names of people who were sent jury notices to serve on a jury. And they wrote back saying, well, I can't serve because I'm not a citizen. If you take an overlap of those two, in many counties, you find hundreds of people who are registered to vote, but they claim they can't serve on a jury because they're not citizens.
Because that's where the jury list comes from in the first place. In a lot of places,
exactly. Yeah. Now, in Fairfax County, Virginia, we once again have prosecutors. This is a very liberal area who have no interest in this. The local election board found hundreds of people who this had been, a part of their registration history, and several cases looked like they were obvious, purposeful violations. People knew what they were doing. They submitted all those names to the local county prosecutor. Not one action, not one question, not one investigation.
John, there's a sense in which even if prosecutorial discretion leads you to say, I'm not going to charge this person, it's still evidence that there are systemic breakdowns.
Bingo.
In the system. You know what I mean? I could literally see, I would choose to not prosecute this person, but on the other hand, we got to do something to fix the structural problem.
Your systemic problem is someone else's systemic opportunity.
Right. Yep. I guess that's what it comes down to. I could chat with you about this all afternoon, but I need to give Merrill Matthews his opportunity as well. So, Dr. Matthews, the floor is yours.
Okay, and then
John is yours.
I'm going to ask two quick questions, and then Tom, you'll start picking up from the people who are online. Mm-hmm. Two quick questions, John. I wrote a piece for The Hill a few weeks ago looking at the turnout in the primaries, raising the question of, all right, how did the states which were passing laws to suppress the vote, how did the turnout look in the primaries? And lo and behold, the ones that the Brennan Center for Justice thought were the worst states trying to suppress the vote, they actually had very high turnouts, in some cases record turnouts. That includes Georgia, Texas, and some other states. Then the Brennan Center came.
There you go again, citing statistics again. That's not fair. Data is not probative. Come on.
Here's my question. The Brennan Center came up, and I noticed just recently they came up and said, well, yes, it looks like a lot of those states actually had real high turnouts, but it wasn't from those who were being suppressed, because the minority vote and some of the others were probably lower votes. So I want, number one, your reaction on that. And number two, New York City, Alaska, some of the states are going to ranked choice voting, which looks like it has turned out to be a complete mess, especially in Alaska, as they just swore in the new Democratic Congresswoman. What are your thoughts about ranked choice voting? So the turnout and the ranked choice voting.
Well, on turnout, we've had dozens and dozens of court cases challenging, for example, voter ID laws. They're discriminatory. They suppress the vote. In these cases, the people they bring forward who claim that they were denied the right to vote, either it's not true, they misunderstood, or in some cases, they don't even exist. They can't find the plaintiff. Or in case of Pennsylvania, the 94-year-old lady in the nursing home who said, well, I can't get a voter ID. So I'm being discriminated against. So the court decision came out. The next day, she got to a bus stop, took the bus a mile down the road to the DMV office, registered to vote, and then went back to the nursing home. She was the lead plaintiff in the argument against voter ID, and she could easily get one. She did the day after the case ended. So on the ranked choice voting, there's a new website, and I will get that for you in a minute, which goes into all of this. In New York City, where I live, we brought in ranked choice voting. Complete mess. Eric Adams only won, but he won a clear plurality of the first choice votes because you have to rank every vote. By the time it got down to the final runoff, he only won by 3,000 votes. We would have had a New York Times endorsed candidate become mayor if ranked choice voting had just moved a few votes more. Ranked choice voting is so confusing, so discriminatory. Even the state of Massachusetts voted it down last year. Massachusetts. One of the reasons cited was this. I have a flash news bulletin for you, Tom and Merrill. Most people are not obsessed by politics. Most people don't spend their day doing what we do, checking Real Clear Politics. They really don't. They have lives to live. They have jobs and hobbies and careers and church and children and everything else in the world to worry about. Did you know that only 8% of people on any given day have a substantive conversation on politics? The rest, live their lives. So a lot of these people, they may know who they like, they may know who they don't like in a race, but there are these 5 or 6 candidates in the middle they've never even heard of. You're supposed to rank choice them, rank choice people you've never heard of. And here's what happens. A majority of people in some of these races, they rank maybe 1, 2, or 3, and then they stop ranking. Well, if the race is close enough, it keeps getting down. They knock off one person. If you don't fill out every ranked choice box, your vote is thrown out at some point because you haven't made a choice. So in New York City, we had 190,000 people vote, but they didn't fill out every box. So what happened? Their vote was thrown out. They had no role in the final result. None. Ranked choice voting is for political geeks and academics and political activists. It is not for average voters.
Okay, so I find this fascinating, John. So I want to play a little bit of the devil's advocate on this topic. I start from a position where I think primaries are actually a pretty lousy way for a party to pick a nominee. And so, I think most people don't realize that we have not always had primaries. I mean, primaries are almost like a relatively recent invention. And it cracks me up that the Republican Party has embraced a very progressive era idea for picking nominees, which is by making it more democratic by using primaries. I have a theory that there's a role for ranked choice voting in primaries, in the parties trying to come up with a nominee who has the broadest possible support, that they're a terrible idea in general elections and special elections, but that they might actually be useful as a reform for a party primary. And after all, primary voters do tend to be more informed than general election voters. So is there any chance that I'm right that there's a place for ranked choice voting party primaries?
You have half a point there. In fact, somebody just submitted a piece to me because I still have good friends at the Wall Street Journal, and I've sent it on to the Journal. They've come up with a ranked choice voting system which doesn't have the flaws that I just described to you. What it does is it has a series of matchups so that every candidate is matched up against every other candidate. So there's a head-to-head, a choice, one-on-one. And the candidate.
So it's a series of binaries is what you're saying. Okay. All right. Okay.
And if you do that, you're not going to end up with the anomaly as in Alaska, where 60% of the voters voted for a Republican for Congress last month, but a Democrat took the seat with only 40% of the vote. You want to avoid that because that undermines confidence in our election process and its fairness. So I agree with you. And, that's up to the states. But notice that the people pushing ranked choice voting only push one version of it. It's one size fits all. Take it or leave it. I've suggested to some of them that this would be an improvement. For some reason, they don't seem interested. Maybe they have other motives and other interests involved. Oh, that couldn't possibly be true.
John, studying elections and voting has made you very cynical.
No, it has made me amused at the human condition.
There you go. It always comes down to human nature, doesn't it?
It has made me fully cognizant of the wide variety of reactions that human beings can have when there are incentives in front of them.
Okay, we've got a number of questions from the audience, so let me try to get to those. So our friend Don Luskin has asked a couple questions. He asked about an update on the Zuckerman funding of election offices. You did that. But he also asks about this.
Started illegal, and if places like Wisconsin and Michigan and some other places elect a Republican governor, that number will grow perhaps significantly.
Okay. He also asks about the idea of auditing elections. And his question is, Don Luskin is a data guy, right?
Yeah, Don is brilliant. Don does data. And he doesn't just do stock market and economics. His stuff, trend macro, is just first rate. Yeah. If you're an investor, go for it.
And we're very lucky to have Don in Dallas. He has relocated to Dallas in the last couple of years, so we're delighted.
Also a very smart observer of income tax rates.
Yeah, Don knows how to respond to incentives. So Don is asking a skeptical question: can election auditing even be done? Now he says here, I don't know if he means specifically. He says, let's say that someday we want to audit a federal election. Can it even be done? Is it even possible to do so?
Yes, but with asterisks. If it's mostly a mail-in election, which is what the left wants, no. Audits, as I mentioned in the description of what happened to that Georgia ballot, are not going to tell you much. The Arizona audit was flawed. It certainly didn't prove the state was won by Trump, which disappointed a lot of people. But it couldn't have proven that, given the limitations on what was available in terms of data. What the audit did reveal, though, was in some cases systemic and in some cases occasional breaches and lapses of chain of custody, misallocation of resources, the fact that some offices were better equipped to handle things than others. There were I think 85 pages of suggestions and recommendations in Maricopa County, Arizona, where Phoenix is, that were offered up, and the legislature and the county supervisors have addressed some of them. But if you think the audit is going to tell you the election came out a different way, we have a secret ballot for a reason. We can't figure out what the secret ballots were. And so the audits have clear limitations. Now, lots of companies have audits. They don't show everything, but if there's something really bad, like giant embezzlement, the audit can uncover it. If it's smaller and more hidden and more cleverly, shoved in a corner, it probably can't. But there's a reason most public companies have audits. They uncover something, even if it's not dramatic. But even that little something can undermine confidence in the fiduciary responsibilities being followed by the management.
John, you make a really good point about, I mean, there is a privacy angle to the idea of voting. And, our solution can't be that we end up undermining the very system of a secret ballot.
We developed the secret ballot in the 1890s. And yes, it was a progressive idea, but conservatives also supported it because we had horrible cases of people being shanghaied and dragged into polling places and told how to vote. We had the parties would print up their own ballots with different colors. So if a voter enters the polling place and they've told their party board healer, I'm going to vote for your party, but they're carrying a pink ballot when they're supposed to have a blue ballot, they might not make it out of the neighborhood without being beaten up. Edgar Allan Poe was probably killed because in Baltimore, he was dragged after being made drunk from polling place to polling place and voting multiple times. He was eventually found in a gutter, completely insensate. He was taken to a hospital and he died. He was probably the most famous victim of voter fraud because he was one of our most popular authors.
That's amazing. I'd never heard that. That's amazing. Bob Decker has a question about, is there a website somewhere to keep up with developments on this topic? You mentioned in sort of our pre-show discussion that the Heritage Foundation and your co-author maintain a database of sorts. What can you tell us about that?
Hans von Spakovsky, my co-author, has 2,000 examples of convictions on voter fraud in all 50 states. And it's incomplete, but it's a pretty good starting point. And there's also a raft of papers and other material on the issue. I also mentioned there's a new website on ranked choice voting, which is very good, by my friend Trent England. It's called www.stoprcv, which stands for ranked choice voting, stoprcv.com. And that'll tell you everything you need to know about ranked choice voting.
We did a Zoom with Trent England on the Electoral College and on the efforts that he's doing there to defend the Electoral College and all of that. So I'm glad to hear that he's involved in that issue as well. Okay, so Scott Jones has a angle on my question about the big sort. And he says, as opposed to thinking about just red states and blue states, perhaps a better question is to ask about the effects of blue cities in red states. In other words, if blue counties cheat while red counties don't, what are the effects? And of course, even in Texas today, we have the situation where all of our major cities now are essentially blue cities, even though Texas is a red state.
I hear that's going to change in Harris County.
Well, from your lips to God's ears.
Well, apparently Ms. Hidalgo, the county judge, is, let's just say that the voters are onto her, so something may happen there.
Okay.
The answer to your question is this. We know that if you look at something often enough times, you will change the outcome. In Minnesota, in that Al Franken case that I referenced earlier, Mark Elias, the most infamous Democratic lawyer, the guy who screams voter suppression every chance he can get, he runs all the recounts for the Democrats. He was Hillary Clinton's lawyer. He, by the way, was also the lawyer who paid for the Steele dossier, the infamous discredited Steele dossier that claimed Donald Trump was a Russian stooge. He paid for it, never told anyone the Democratic National Committee and Hillary were behind it, and he lied to everybody that the DNC and he had paid for it. So he's not exactly a lawyer of good character. He went into the Franken race in 2008, the one that gave us Obamacare, and he filed suits and looked over the shoulders of every county clerk. And what you found was this: in the race was decided by absentee votes. And if you look at an absentee vote critically enough, you can rule it in or rule it out. I mean, how close is the signature? Did somebody forget to put a comma in? Did somebody not have a middle initial in their name when it appears on the registration signature? And Republican counties pretty much naturally went by the book. This is the rule, we'll follow it. Democratic counties almost instinctively had more play in the joints, more leeway. So they would allow in more absentee ballots, and being Democratic counties, that meant more votes for Franken. In the end, Franken won by 311 votes. Now, there are all kinds of reasons why Franken didn't win that race. For example, we now know, after all the recounts were finished, it came to light that 1,200 felons who had not been granted their civil rights did vote. And the Fox affiliate did a poll of them, and 90% said they voted for Franken. So in a 311 vote race, 1,200 felons, 90% vote for the other candidate, you can pretty much say that the result is in question. And that's just another example. If you have two sets of rules, and this was the Florida election in 2000, Bush v. Gore. Gore only wanted the Democratic counties to recount. He didn't want the other counties to recount. And the Supreme Court said that is a violation of equal protection. You cannot have two different standards. You cannot just recount here and not recount over here.
John, is there, again, we've talked about how states and really even counties run elections in our system. If you think back about the Florida hanging chads mess, you described this ballot in Georgia where you separate the perforation and you can never again connect those again. It seems like every state and sometimes even every county is like constantly reinventing the wheel.
Well, yes, but let me tell you, Florida, for example, really was embarrassed by the 2000 election. And since then, we've had 4 governors. All of them have moved the ball forward on voter integrity and voter efficiency. Florida now has one of the best systems in the country. It reports within an hour and a half all the votes were in Florida in 2020. Hour and a half. Some states take months. I mean, in Montgomery County, Maryland, it took 4 weeks to count the votes for the county executive in the state's biggest county, Montgomery. It's a complete mess in some states because it's designed to be that way. The Constitution refers to election day. It doesn't say election month. Did you know that North Carolina is voting early now? Now. There have been no debates. Liberals and Democrats don't want campaigns. They want people voting like robots. Republicans would too, except they don't have the opportunity to do that as much because the suburbs aren't so easily organized, aren't so densely packed with voters of one party. So this is not a reflection against only one party, but there are people who don't want campaigns because campaigns discuss issues. And if you're on the wrong side of an issue, people might vote against you. So you don't want campaigns. You just want people voting. In some cases, just blindly.
So the question was going to be, is there any nonpartisan organization that publishes like best practices or something like that? But it sounds like it wouldn't matter.
Yes.
Because
yes. The Election Assistance Commission is a federal agency that was set up after Florida. They don't decide elections. They provide best practices. They hold hearings. They take testimony. They consult election officials. It's an evenly balanced panel, 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans. And they do a pretty good job because their mandate is very limited. It is, you might want to look at this. Some guy over here has got a new machine. You might want to look at that. That's a good place to start. There's some places that are pretty reliable. The Pew Research Center does pretty good work. They did the work that showed between 15 and 25% of registered voters nationwide, the information there was invalid or unusable.
Speaking of machines, we have a question. Can we please go back to paper ballots? And
No.
Well, I actually have an anecdote here because I actually was an election judge in my county here in Texas for a couple of cycles. And we were using electronic tablets. And I was struck by the extent to which we went to in our county to make sure that that was a secure process, to make sure that the machines were air gapped, they could not be connected to the internet, Nonetheless, my county finally made the decision to return to paper ballots because of the level of distrust that had occurred. So why do you say no to, can we please go back to paper ballots?
What's the phrase, jumping from the frying pan into the fire?
Okay.
There's a reason why countries overseas often use paper ballots. They're usually voting for one thing. Their member of parliament or, a president.
It's a parliamentary system.
Well, there's one thing on the ballot.
Yeah.
Canada, which by the way does require voter ID nationwide. Canada, you go in their election and you're voting for your member of parliament. That's it. Easy to count. I grew up in San Francisco. I once had 131 things to vote on. Now, Texas isn't that bad, but Texas can have dozens of things on the ballot.
Yep.
School board, mosquito abatement commission, local bond measures.
And you got to fill out that little oval on every single one of them.
Well, actually, I think the machines, if we spent enough money on the machines, we could have more confidence in them. Do you notice, Tom, I'll ask you a question and just be honest. You take money out of ATMs, right?
Yeah.
Do you count the number of bills every single time you take money out of an ATM? Every single time?
I never do.
Why?
I trust it. I trust the system. Uh-oh. We have lost John.
Huh.
Well, let's wait for a second and see if he comes back. If not, we still got lots of good material and we're close to the time where we were going to stop anyway. But it looks like we lost John. Dr. Matthews, what were your thoughts on what John was talking about?
Well, I thought they were, John knows this better than anyone, but I was stunned by his comment about New York sending out those ballots. And when he said they are pre-filled out, did you understand him to mean that they already have the candidates selected when they're filled out?
I think what he was saying was that the application for an absentee ballot was already pre-filled out.
Okay.
And that the reason was the COVID national emergency, which, as you and I have joked about many times, look, either there's a national emergency or there isn't. But you can't pick and choose, right? There can't be no national emergency, so we're going to change our border policies. But there is a national emergency, so we're going to forgive student loans, and we're going to send out absentee ballots to everybody. So,
and the other question I would have asked is along the lines of, I think there's 5 or 6 states that have all mail-in ballots, including, I believe, Utah, some conservative states in that. If he feels like those states do a pretty good job of being able to ensure that the mail-in ballots are secure and accurate.
Yeah. Well, on the assumption that John has run into a technical problem and is not going to be able to join us again, let me just remind everybody, this is the book, Our Broken Elections. Let's see here. I got to figure out how to do this backward. This is like shaving not in a mirror. How the left changed the way you vote. I will tell you right now that the Kindle version of this book is on a big sale on Amazon. So if you're a tablet and Kindle kind of a person like I am, you can get it on a big sale right now from Amazon. If you're a hardback guy, like I think Dr. Matthews is, you can get it in hardback form as well. We will convey to John later privately oh, here he comes.
Oh, he's back.
Hey, we lost you there for a minute.
Oh,
we lost you for a minute. So Dr. Matthews and I were discussing your presentation.
Well, let me tell you, we now have a public policy lesson here.
Okay.
I happen to be in California. Guess what just happened?
You have a power outage?
Yes.
Oh my.
The office building I'm at, or the hotel, I should say the hotel I'm at, just moved to a generator, standby generator.
Wow.
So we could have a second seminar on why my home state of California is suffering brownouts.
Yeah, we'll do one on energy policy. Well, I'm so delighted you were able to come back and join us. I want to, because there's one more question here that I want to ask you.
Do we still have people on board?
Yes, we do.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, I apologize to everyone listening.
That's fine. If you're in California, you're going to have power outages.
If you had not made it back, it was still an excellent presentation, but this gives us a chance to wrap up with you personally.
Well, anyway, just finishing on the ATM.
Yeah.
You trust the ATM because it's a sophisticated machine and the banks want to keep their customers happy. Those cost about 8 times more than the typical voting machine. We probably should spend more money on voting machines than we do. Not 8 times, but something, because if we spent more money rather than the lowest bid, we probably would get a better, more reliable result. And, here's why we don't want to go to paper ballots. Handicapped people, visually impaired people, the machines that we have do a lot for people, including those with foreign language issues, that paper ballots can't do.
It's really a great point, because it's become almost an article of faith, at least in the Texas Republican Party, that paper ballots are moral and machines are immoral. But you make a good point. We interact with machines all the time and have complete confidence.
Actually, Tom, let me tell you, I'll tell you the story that got me into this whole issue.
Okay.
It involved a paper ballot. There was a special election for a state legislature in California. I was doing a term paper in college. I went down and I watched the recount because it was so close. It was on paper ballots. So I watched voter fraud in front of me. I was the only observer who was there who wasn't a partisan every day. I saw voter fraud being committed in front of me. People ask, well, why didn't you report it to the authorities? And I say, well, the authorities were the ones doing it. Here's what they would do. Let's say you have a paper ballot in front of you and there's two circles. One circle has a check, the other circle is blank, right? During the recount, I saw election workers put a little bit of pencil under their fingernail and they would mark the unmarked circle, declaring a null vote. In other words, the vote was originally for candidate A, and then suddenly it looked as if somebody had voted for A and B. Now, the vote was close enough. It was 21 votes before the recount. It was close enough. It wasn't obvious to everyone, and they didn't have to do it a lot. But in the end, they subtracted enough votes that their candidate won.
Wow.
That was a paper ballot.
Yeah. And of course, the hanging Chad was a paper ballot too.
In another way, form.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Okay. So we have a couple of questions. Let's wrap up with this topic. And that is, why is it a foregone conclusion that higher turnout is better than lower turnout? And this resounds a little bit with me, because I used to say sometimes in talks that I would give that I actually like low voter turnout because it's a sign that people are generally content. When you see the countries with high voter turnout, they tend to be countries that are in constant political turmoil.
Right, but that is so easily misinterpreted. You shouldn't say it.
Okay. So what are your thoughts on this issue of, should the level of voter turnout matter to anyone other than like the candidates and the parties themselves?
Everyone in your audience has two civil rights when it comes to voting. One is to make sure that there's no coercion, there's no blockage, artificial barriers to voting, no unusual tests. We don't have property qualifications for voting. We don't have age qualifications other than being 18. We don't kick people off the rolls if they're 75 automatically. That's one civil right we all need to have. The Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act help get us that. But all of your people in the audience have another civil right, not to have their vote canceled out by someone who shouldn't be voting, someone who doesn't exist, someone who's moved out of town, who's a felon, not eligible to vote, someone whose registration is in a parking lot. That effectively bars you from casting a legitimate vote, as much as if someone were standing in the polling house door saying you can't vote here today.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We have a number of folks, Don Luskin, Catherine Gibb, David Henderson, who have all said thank you for your talk. They enjoyed your talk very much. We have a request to show the book again, so I'm going to show the book.
David Henderson's book on the Encyclopedia of Economics is a treasure. And if you want to understand economics and you don't want to read a 700-page textbook, but you want a reference book that'll explain any individual topic, I can't recommend that book more highly.
David is newly associated with us here at IPI, and he's writing for us regularly on tax issues. So we're very pleased about that. John, how can people follow your work? How can people follow you on social media? Where's the best way for people to follow your work?
I'm an active Twitter feed at John Fund. If you go to National Review, just type in my name, my archive will come up. I also have an archive at foxnews.com, the website for Fox News. And of course, my books are all over Amazon. And if you look at all of those avenues, you'll probably have enough of me.
Okay. Well, John, we really appreciate it. We appreciate the fact that many times over the years, you've given of your time to us and to our audience. We very much appreciate that. Look forward to having you back in Dallas again sometime soon.
I enjoy it, and good luck. IPI is one of my favorite groups.
Thank you, John. And again, I want to remind folks that this video will be archived on our website and also on our YouTube channel. So you'll be able to share it with others. You'll be able to review it yourself and recommend it to people. With that, I will remind you that if you want to know more about IPI, if you'd like to get involved with us, please email Addie Crimmins. Her email address is on all of the written communication you got related to this event. We would love to have you be a part of our organization. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great afternoon, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, John.
Thank you.